and welcome. This is Lisa Jones, and you are listening to the Exploring Death podcast. Hello and welcome to the Exploring Death podcast. I'm Lisa Jones, your host, and today I have with me Dr. Terri Daniel. She is a clinical chaplain, certified trauma professional, and end-of-life educator, certified in death, dying, and bereavement. Her life work focuses on helping the dying and the bereaved find healing through meditative, ceremonial, and therapeutic processes that focus on inner transformation rather than external events. She is the author of 4 books on death and the afterlife, and is also the founder of the annual Afterlife Awareness Conference. Terri also has a podcast, Ask Dr. Death, launching in February on all major platforms. Welcome, Terri.
Thank you, Lisa. So nice to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you. I met you last year at the Afterlife Conference, and what a joy it was to attend. I felt as soon as I saw that you were having it, I hadn't been aware of it before, but as soon as I saw it, I just had to make reservations and jump on a plane and leave Maui to go to it. And I met such amazing people, and the presentations were amazing. So I highly recommend anyone listening to the podcast right now, check it out because it's phenomenal. You've got great resources there.
Thank you. It's an amazing conference, and we're going into our 10th year. This is our 10th year, which is amazing because I always said if we make it to 10 years, I would be really surprised and really grateful. And so, 2020 in Chicago, I hope you'll come.
Oh my gosh, that sounds fantastic. And how did that start? I'm curious. I mean, in this, you've got such an amazing resume of all of this, death experience. So I'm just curious, what brought you to this?
Well, it was kind of fluky. So I got interested in death work after my son died in 2006. And he was very ill for a long time, severely disabled. So I was with him through the whole thing, and being with him during his actual process of leaving his body was one of the most amazing things I ever experienced. And I knew I wanted to do that again and again. So soon after that, I became a hospice volunteer. But along the way, I wrote a book about my son's death. And there was a group, a national grief group for bereaved parents, bringing their conference to Portland. And so I pitched them as a speaker. I said, I'd like to come and talk about my experiences communicating with my son. And they said, absolutely not. We don't allow any presentations of that sort of thing because it upsets all our parents, because they may not be getting messages or, and so no, we don't allow, and it's too spiritual and it's politically, they just were like ridiculous. And I started asking around to other people I knew in the field at the time. This was in 2010. Bill Guggenheim and Sandy Goodman and people who also had books like mine. And they told me that they had all been rejected by this group as well. So I said, well, I just have to start my own conference. And so that's how I did. And Bill and Sandy and several other people you probably know were on my original board, founding members of the conference, and we unders for seed money, which didn't amount to much, and started the first conference. That's how it started.
That. I mean, talk about the mother of invention, right? I mean, it's like you're not welcomed into this group of of people that have had similar situations, and so gosh, start your own. That's fantastic.
That's how it happened, and I've really been, and not just me, but a lot of us have been kind of battling with that group for a long time, because they had a strict policy is we will not allow any presentations on anything paranormal or spiritual.
Oh my gosh, so interesting. Are you familiar with the Helping Parents Heal group?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and they're having their first or second conference this year. And my goodness, I've heard it's like for 500 people, and I think it's nearly sold out. I mean, they're open to this. I mean, that's the whole point. Well,
they kind of started the same way I did. A lot of their people came from that other group, and they started in response to this exact same thing. They said, we want to have a group where we can talk about these things.
Right.
Because it's happening, and people need a place to talk about it.
Absolutely. And that's what's so amazing to me. And I feel as though it, people are really waking up to this happening. And I mean, that's when my husband died and I was in corporate America, and then people knew that I was kind of spiritual or had the spiritual awakening with it. I'd be at cocktail parties and these CEOs, CFOs would walk up to me in the corner and be like, so my dad died and he came to me and I don't know what to do about this,
Yeah.
and so, but it's like, it's always kind of behind closed doors or in dark
It's in the
alleys,
closet.
or
It's in the closet,
I
like
know, and
anything else that society doesn't accept.
and it's so, I mean, especially for those of us have been there. I mean, I love talking about it because I feel like it brings so much healing, right, to the whole situation. When it's kept in the dark and in the closet, that's where all the pain and suffering, I think, really just festers and makes it worse.
Well, it definitely brings healing for most people. For some people, it just doesn't, because for so many reasons, some people have religious obstructions,
Right.
but they're not really See, the thing about that, people always say to me, I never receive any messages from my loved ones. And I say, well, tell me about your experience. And it turns out they're receiving them all the time. And they're just calling it a coincidence. His favorite bird was a green bluebird, and all of a sudden that bird came and sat on my window every day, but that was just a coincidence. I'm like, no, it's not. So the fact is, you really are receiving signs. You just don't know how to recognize them.
That's right. I love that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I feel like the same thing, like people are so stuck in believing they're not getting signs,
Right.
and so what ideas or ways do you help people kind of recognize that they are
Well,
actually?
the first thing I would tell people to do is to keep a journal, because that's how I started. Even before my son died, I kept a journal of my dreams and every interdimensional experience that I had, plus just, stuff that was happening between him and me. And then when I started getting signs, I wrote them all down, because if you don't hold on to it, it'll just go away and you'll forget about it. And I've been keeping a dream journal actually since 1997. So I was used to it, but that would be my first advice to people, because then you're going to see that bird landed on your windowsill many more times than you think it did. You just don't remember. And meditation is another thing, of course, and the way I teach meditation is not the way most people think of it in the Zen form, where you just go blank. This is not what we want to do. I say it opens you to messages. So you can sit and do your meditation with your pen and paper or your tape recorder and talk and record what you're feeling, what's visions are coming through. It's sort of like channeling meditation, I guess you could say. And you'll train yourself to start recognizing and recording all the messages as they come.
Wow, I love that. And I want to hear more about this dream journal from 1990. Did you say 7?
Yeah, 1997.
So tell me, because I've heard of this before and I love the concept of it, but I guess I don't know if I'm lazy or because I have some crazy wild dreams and I would love to record them, but I just can't seem to get there. But what have you learned from the journal? Maybe if you tell me what you've learned, I'll be more inspired.
Well, I'm lazy too. I don't write them all down. So 97, I would wake up from a dream and I would run to my computer and just type it in Word. Then later on, I got a little handheld tape recorder, that I kept next to the bed. And then later than that, it was a phone, right? But in 97, we didn't have phones like that. So if I wake up from a dream that's really significant, I'll just record it into my phone and then send that recording to myself. And then when I get up in the morning, it'll be in my email and I'll type it into my Word document. So my dream journal from 97 is a Word document that's like 200 pages long, single spaced. And, it has the dates and the dreams. And I'm a really avid dreamer. I love my dream world. I take naps during the day just so I can go into the dream world. So for me, it's pretty easy because it's just always at the front of my thinking and I remember the details, but it may be that it's easy because I've been doing it for so long.
Right. Yeah. Because it's part of your routine.
So just record it into your phone and then transfer it into a Word document. And by the time you're done, you've got a book. Seriously. You
That
could
is
publish a
amazing.
book of your dreams. Not that anybody would want to read a book of your dreams, but
Exactly, but you'd have enough material for a book for sure.
yeah.
So what, if you're willing to share, you don't have to, no pressure, but is there anything that like you don't think you would have realized in your life if you hadn't have kept this journal? Or like, is there anything that comes to mind that's just like, wow, that was a turning point because I was able to put the dots together? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the thing that it shows me the most is that it shows me where I'm still holding on to trauma from past events and past relationships, because I still have dreams about those events or variations of them. So that tells me that it's still not resolved in my psyche. So that's really big. When I was starting to do a lot of meditation and channeling, I had just the sweetest, I once had a dream where I was in this house that was like several stories, say 3 or 4 stories. And I kept walking up the stairs, curious about what was up there. And when I got to the attic, it was like Santa's workshop with little elves making things. I swear this is true. And I knew immediately what that was. That was going up to the higher levels of consciousness, to where spirit guides and ancestors and helpers are up in the attic, right up here. And it was just a validation, like, yeah, that's what you're doing. You're going up there and you're hearing from those people. They're working on you.
I love it. That is so cool. And I love that visualization of, and like you said, it's symbolic, right? These things that are happening in your dreams are symbols of, things that are happening in your real life. And that, I think that's the key. And maybe that's part of why I'm always like, I don't know how to figure out what the symbolism is, but I guess over time, as you keep this journal, you'll begin to uncover.
I don't really, the old understanding of dreams based on Freud and was that it was symbolic. But at the same time of Freud, there was Carl Jung, and he and Freud hung out together and they argued about this. And Jung said, no, it's not symbolic. It's just your inner archetypes speaking.
Oh, okay.
And so, Freud said a snake represents a penis, and Jung said, sometimes a snake is just a snake.
Right.
And a snake represents all kinds of things throughout history. It represents wisdom and spirituality, from ancient cultures. But, Freud was kind of hung up on the sex thing. But it is sort of symbolic, but I guess walking upstairs to a top floor of a house certainly is symbolic of going to higher realms, but that doesn't seem like a big mystery to me. To see,
yeah, that's true.
Literal.
That's true. But I guess like the Santa's helpers and the toy shop and all that, it's like, oh, and then to make the leap to, higher consciousness, which I love. And I totally, and I think too, it's about you feeling the resonance with that, that belief. And again, you're right. You didn't say symbolic. I was jumping to that conclusion.
But it is sometimes. There's so many, oh my God, my dreams are so amazing, and I've read books about dreams. And so there's things, if you dream of a moving vehicle, like a car or a boat or a plane, it represents the self. So if you're driving the car, you're in charge of the self, or if you're in the back seat and someone else is driving, it means that you feel like someone else is in control of where you're going. It's symbolic, but it's logical.
Right. Oh my gosh, I love it. Well, and also talk about, or I'd love to hear your input, because, there's variations of dreams. I sometimes wake up and it's very clear in my mind, but they just slip away. Like the minute I turn over to try to write it down, like it just, boom, it like evaporates. Whereas the other night I had the most incredible dream that felt so real. And it was me literally standing down here at the beach that I go to every day. And the whale was as big as the island that is I look at every day, and it was huge, and we were all standing on the shore looking at this giant whale. And so anyway, but it still sits with me. This was a dream I had maybe a week or 2 ago, and I can easily pull it right up, whereas so many dreams, they're just evaporate. So do you have any?
Well, and some of them aren't as important as others, and once you get into the habit of writing them down, you'll be able to tell the difference of which ones are important and which ones aren't.
Yeah. And,
whale, you live in Hawaii, so there's whales all the time, but this is why it's important to study other cultures and ancient traditions, because whale has incredible spiritual significance. Yeah. Every animal does. But
Yeah,
it's different in different cultures. Like a
that's right.
monkey means one thing in South America and another thing in India. But,
Hmm.
in America, we're so insulated from nature that we don't have any of that. We don't have animal totems. We don't have rituals. We don't celebrate natural cycle holidays. We've covered over them with Christian holidays. But so this leads me to another thought about, bringing in teachings from other cultures is what we really need to help us with grief and with spiritual practices of all kind, including near-death experience.
I love that. And I was just going to transition to that as well, because I do feel like our society has just like covered up death. I mean, it's like we've been anesthetized to it, right? Like, let's
Yep.
just take it away, put it in a sterile, silver box or something, and just forget about it. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of the body. We'll, and just go about your business and move on. And it's like, holy cow, now since I've done a death doula training and I've hospice work and doing all these interviews with people and actually sitting with dying people, my husband and my mom and my dad. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful to me than somebody transitioning. I mean, there is so much, like, if people knew how much glory and gold and just beauty and love that is infused in the room. I mean, I feel like people would be clamoring to
So
sit with their loved
true.
ones.
And the word doula comes from birth doula, and people often say it's like birth, but just going in door and out, one door and out the other. Birth is violent. People are screaming. It's much better than birth.
Oh, I
Because,
love that. I've never
yeah,
thought of that before, but you're
yeah,
absolutely right. There's so much pain
there's
involved with
pain and fear,
birth.
and the baby's
Yes.
screaming, and the mother's screaming, and doctors are there, and it's a very different experience. And nobody's crying. People are crying because they're sad, that the person is leaving, but death is a much more peaceful experience than birth.
Oh my gosh. I love that so much, because that was what happened. I had my out of body experience the night my husband died. And so it was a shared death experience where I went to heaven and I saw the welcome party where he was coming in. And
Mm-hmm.
just as he was entering, they knocked on the door and I woke up, and I was so filled with love and joy and happiness and just, excitement for seeing where he was going. I mean, there was no, like, I didn't know. I still had 3 living grandparents at that time. I was 37 and my grandparents lived 101, 102, 106. So they died after my
Wow.
husband. So I really didn't have any firsthand death experience. But holy cow, I was like, if this is what dying is, like, this is amazing, And meanwhile, his brother and his best friend were kind of looking at me so weird because they thought I would just be, I don't know what, hysterical or something. But because of this just beautiful gift I was given of the shared death experience, it transformed my whole
Exactly.
life. I mean, it just absolutely,
How can it not?
right, right.
No.
So and that's where, I so encourage people to lean in when they have a friend who's dying, or, a family member, and be there with them. I mean, yes, it's sad, right? I mean, we miss the physical presence of our loved ones, but the whole process to me was a real gift.
Yeah, and it's so precious to be invited into that process. And so lots of people that I run into in my work and people who come to the conference, they're like, okay, I did death doula training. Now, how do I get my foot in the door at the local hospice? And sadly, you can't.
That's right.
And,
Yeah.
and people are really disappointed because they think because they did, Olivia Barham's death doula training, or Jerry Grace Lyons, or whichever one is, there's a few really good ones out there, that they can go to a hospice and get a job. And you absolutely can't. And this is why I encourage people to go the academic route as much as possible. So for me, I wanted to work in hospice. You can be a volunteer, but you can't, as a volunteer, you can't do any sort of healing practice. You're a volunteer, basically just keeps someone company and is present and listens. You can't do any doula work. They will fire you immediately. You can't have spiritual conversations. You can't do Reiki, Can't do any of that as
Well,
volunteer.
here in Maui, we can.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, they've opened the door so we can do Reiki and we can do, other modalities, which is
And
really beautiful.
it does differ by state and
Yeah.
hospice by hospice, but
Right.
generally they're very strict about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was a volunteer, I was seeing that so many people were having spiritual issues with their belief systems, and I really wanted to help them with the toxic religion they were experiencing. But as a volunteer, they would have fired me immediately if I did that. So I went back to school and got a bunch of degrees and trained as a chaplain. So now I'm allowed to talk to patients in clinical settings about that.
Wow, beautiful. And what a great way to, get your foot in the door, quote unquote, because I agree. The doula thing is certainly not welcomed in the hospice. I mean, here on Maui either. I mean, it's a whole separate thing to, be.
So, but Reiki you can.
But Reiki we can, yeah. And, And like you said, every hospice is different. So it's interesting. But that's what I have to say is I was curious how you got into becoming the chaplain, but that's how, because you weren't able to really help people as much as you'd like to.
That's how I got, I would be sitting with people and they would be telling me about their fear of going to hell, or their adult children would be sitting there trying to save them for Jesus before they die, because otherwise they're going to hell. And I would hear all this stuff. And I just could not keep my mouth shut, but I knew I had to. And so I said, no, being a volunteer is not going to work for me. I need to be a chaplain. I need to be the person that can talk to them about this. So first thing I did is I went and got a bachelor's degree in religious studies. And toward the end of that time, I went and did CPE, clinical pastoral education, which is the training you're supposed to have as a clinical chaplain. And then I liked academics so much that I ended up getting a master's in pastoral care. And by the time I was done with all that, I realized I didn't want to be a chaplain after all, because I wanted to teach, because I love public speaking and teaching. So I quickly found out that if you want to go teach in a university, you have to have a doctorate. So back to school I went, and spent $140,000 in student loans to get a doctorate. And now I'm looking for a teaching job. And I have my workshops and the stuff. I travel around the country and I do trainings for hospice workers, and I've got plenty of that to do. But I really want to be in a college classroom teaching undergrads about death, dying, and bereavement, so that we can raise a new generation of death-aware people.
Oh, fantastic. So, and what study what would they be studying to be able to take that course? I mean,
well, you could, a lot of colleges now, in particular, the University of Colorado in Boulder, as you probably know, Boulder's really advanced with all this stuff. Kitty Edwards is there, and a lot of conscious dying work is going on there. You should interview her, by the way.
Yeah, I just was writing her name down.
Okay, good. They're starting to teach death, dying, and bereavement classes in colleges. It's few and far between, but it is popping up here and there. And it's taught sometimes in the psychology department, sometimes in nursing, sociology. There's all different places it can pop up. It can be in religious studies. But one of the things I found out is that medical schools and nursing schools don't touch it ever. Medical schools are even worse. So I've gone and been a guest lecturer at some classes for nursing schools, University of San Francisco and Sonoma State. And I'm talking to these nursing students who are about to graduate. So 4 years they've been in there. And they would come up to me afterwards and say, this is the first lecture we ever had about death in our entire curriculum.
I think I heard that at your conference last year. And again, my chin is on the floor as I'm hearing you say it again, because it just is so, it makes me angry to think that our doctors and nurses are being educated without this information. Hello, this is, it just makes me crazy.
And that's the nurses. And they're the ones who are there when the patients are actually dying. Doctors aren't there. The doctors come in, say hello, look at the chart, and go away. But the doctors have the responsibility to help the patients accept death, because the doctor is the one who's sitting with the patient, giving them the life-threatening diagnosis. Hello, Mrs. So-and-so, you've got 4th stage lung cancer. But we have a new clinical trial coming out, or we can give you some more chemo and some stuff. So of course the patient is going to say, whatever you say, doctor. And what the doctor doesn't say is, here's what'll happen if you do chemo. You're 91 years old. It's going to be terrible and you're going to die anyway.
Right.
That's what they should be saying, but they don't. And, the poor patient doesn't understand what her choices are. And I'm really passionate about this right now because my father's going through this because he's 93. Wow. And he just had a melanoma. And fortunately, it turned out to be benign. But, they were talking about chemo for a 93-year-old man. It happens.
Yeah, I know. And even as my husband, who was sick for 7 years, and he was 44 when he passed, the doctors, I can't even begin to tell you the amount of torture that this man went through, including 3 stem cell transplants, which brings you to the brink of death before they build your system back up again.
That's right.
And I understand he wanted to try everything possible to keep living on this earth. But I've decided if I ever get diagnosed, I'm ready to check out. Like I am not going to go through that torture. It just.
Me too. 44 years old, of course you're going to try everything, and that makes sense. But, they foist it on people in their 90s. And I have seen doctors that I had a guy once who had, congestive heart failure. He was in ICU. He was 89. His body was trying to die. And, he wasn't eating. He was ready to go. That's what, the body tells us. And this was the father of a friend of mine. And I said to my friend, tell the doctor you want a hospice referral. So my friend said, okay, because, regular people don't know to do that. Right. And the doctor said to him, I don't give hospice referrals until the patient is 3 days from death, which is the dumbest thing in the world because, number one, you have no way of knowing that when a person's 3 days from death. And the whole point of hospice is to get in there sooner rather than later so that you have a painless and peaceful last few weeks or months or whatever. You don't just make them suffer until the last 3 days, even if you could, which you can't.
Right. Yeah. I'm so happy you brought that up because I would love to know. I feel like hospice has a bad rap in general. Like people, they hear the word hospice and they just think, oh, I'm throwing in the towel. I'm giving up. And in fact, my husband who died, like, no, I don't want hospice. I don't want hospice. It was up until literally 2 days before he died that he became incoherent. And the doctor said, well, let's call hospice. And I'm like, absolutely. And now that I am a volunteer for hospice, I realize I could have had 6 months or more of help. Like it was me and my 2 children who were 8 and 10 and my husband, and I was doing it all. And it would have been such a benefit to have help around that whole situation.
Well, and it's hard when someone's as young as your husband was because you don't go to hospice until you decide not to do further interventions.
Right.
So that's why when someone's that young, you really do wait a long time because you have all this hope that it's going to change. And you don't go to hospice until you feel comfortable with, no more interventions. So you probably didn't feel that way until much later.
You're right. Well, and I was leaving it up to him. I knew, like intuitively, I knew he was going to die, but he was not, he wasn't ready to go there. So I felt like I held that space so he could do what he needed to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you're right, as people are older and it's much more, they've had a full life and everything, I guess hospice is brought in sooner.
That's why you don't hear a lot about children's hospice because, parents never want to get to that point where they decide no more treatment, where, with a child, you just never want to accept death.
Yeah. And is there something, I don't know. I understand hospice is like 6 months, you have to have a prescription, right? You've got like 6 months is kind of
that's not always. That's not necessarily true because for, Medicare and Medicaid to cover it, that is their requirement.
Right.
But nobody can say that you have 6 months to live. That's just impossible to predict.
Exactly. I don't know. I guess in my mind, I love, at least here in Maui, I love the Maui Hospice that I'm a volunteer for. And I just see how much comfort and peace and love that it brings to the family. And I just like, I don't know, I'm a huge advocate for hospice but I understand that it's just such a scary word for people that are in it because they don't want to it's giving up, or that's what they think it is, but it's not. To me, it's really having a supportive end of life plan.
And that I blame that on the doctors. And this goes back to the doctors don't get any education. So I have asked many doctors this question of all ages, doctors in their 70s and doctors that just graduated from medical school. Did you have any training in end-of-life care? And they all say, no. If you want to specialize in it, you could do a rotation in palliative medicine, but it's like an elective. Right. So you can choose it, like you can choose a rotation in surgery or gynecology, but most of them don't choose it. And so you have these doctors who are really calling the shots, and they don't even know what hospice is.
Right. Well, and also in the medical field, it's like dying is like, that's the worst outcome. Like they don't want you to die, because that's them failing in their, treating the patient, basically.
And, I hate to say this, but not only do they not want you to die, they want to keep asses in beds in hospitals and keep all that money flowing in. Yeah. And do you know that, and just the other day, I told this statistic to someone, and I may not be saying this exactly right, but I think it's something like this. 25% of the entire Medicare budget is spent in the last 6 months of life, and 60% of that amount is spent in the last 30 days.
Right. Yeah, I've heard statistics similar to that, which is just outrageous. It's like trying to keep the person, propped up or something instead of just, and they do all these wild, crazy interventions to, again, like, 91-year-olds, giving them chemo, and which it's the worst. Like, that's not a good way to end.
Oh, chemo will kill you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, that was the other thing, is that my husband, because we had gone, our insurance company wouldn't pay for us to have treatment where we lived in Connecticut. They said you have to go to MD Anderson or to Seattle, to the Cancer Care Alliance. And so we were in a hotel for 9 months while he was getting treatments. And then near the end, they just said, okay, you're going home tomorrow. And we were like, what's happening? And basically my thought is, I don't know for certain, but I feel like they didn't want him to die on their watch, because then it would go against their statistics.
That's exactly right. They don't want you to die in the hospital. They will always get you out of there if you're going to die, because hospitals are rated on many criteria, and how many deaths they have is one of them.
My gosh. See, intuitively, I knew it. I just had never heard somebody say that before. So thank you for confirming that.
Well, that was one of the first things they told us in chaplaincy training, like on the first day when we all showed up and we're sitting there and we don't know what to expect, and we're brand new and we've never ever set foot in a hospital in a professional way before. And they give us this orientation. That was one of the first things they told us. And they also told us that the thing that the hospital makes the most money on is always surgery. So that's why, they'll sell surgery and they won't let you die. And then I also, I have 3 relatives who are emergency room doctors, if you can imagine what our dinner table conversation is like. And they will tell me that, people don't die in the emergency room. You never want them to die in your ER. Even if you know they're going to die, you want to just get them patched up and onto a medical floor. And then the medical floor wants to get them out because of that whole statistical thing.
That is crazy. It reminds me of the airlines and them pushing back from the gate just so they get an on-time departure, even though they'll just sit there for however long. And then, it doesn't count because we already pushed back. So we're actually, that is insane. I wanted to quickly ask you about the chaplain, school that you went to, or the education, because was that not filled with religious doctrine, or how is that different? Because I'm curious. Yeah.
That's a great question. And it's a big issue. So, I was talking to someone yesterday who heard that I was a chaplain and called me up and said, oh, are you a Christian chaplain? And I said, no, I'm not even a Christian person. Oh, when they told me you were a chaplain, I just assumed. And that's the big thing that we hate. And so one of the things we're trying to do is change the word chaplain to something else, but we haven't really come up with anything yet. But traditionally, the chaplain on, army, military chaplain, there are corporate chaplains. There's a little video out called Chaplain, which you can find on Amazon, I think, that talks about all this. are Christian, because it's America, and that's what most of the patients are. And it is not religious training. It's not supposed to be. One of the things that you learn in good quality CPE, clinical pastoral education, is how to not be religious and how to leave your spiritual beliefs at the door, which means that regardless of what you believe, when you walk in there and talk to a patient, you go where they are. And you don't judge them, and you don't try to talk them out of it. You just try to make them comfortable wherever they are. And that is super hard for everybody to do. And it's particularly hard for evangelicals to do, because their mission, according to their belief, is that they have to go out and preach to everybody. So for an evangelical to be a good chaplain is almost impossible. And I've seen many of them, and I've seen evangelical so-called chaplains and have found out that they didn't have the proper training. They were just pastors from the local church, and they would go into the patient's room and try to save them before they died.
Evangelize with them. Oh my God, that sounds terrible.
It is. It's very terrible.
Well, you know what? I would love to pull cards on that if you're okay.
Sure.
I'd just love to see what comes up about, again, this idea of, you're just really there to support them.
It's spiritual support or spiritual care. So, we should be called spiritual care providers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I like that. Okay. So the first card is gratitude, and this is actually the blockage card. And so I'm trying to just tune in here with the block of gratitude is. I think the whole idea that, people aren't grateful for somebody trying to evangelize them at the end of at the deathbed or whatever, or they're, they, like you said, they want you to come in and be where they're at, not go in with an agenda of what they're doing. And so that's where I'm seeing that this block of gratitude is, because again, when you're on your deathbed, the last thing you need is anybody coming in and telling you, anything, right? Other than just supporting them on their journey. And so really the best part about that is the opening that brings. If you can walk in there with a clear heart and a clear mind, allowing people to really open up and be who they are and where they are in their experience. And I love it then, because then it's an outcome of pleasure. And so I love just that this idea of a spiritual support person that comes in, and really, because again, I think we all have traumas about our religious upbringings, at least I do. Mm-hmm. Both my Lutheran and my Episcopal ministers both hit on me at various times. One when I was 15, and the other one my husband was dying. So it's like, what's happening right now? So yeah, I have a real problem with organized religion. And so the idea of having them come in, and even the day that came to my husband, to my home, the day he died, he was an interim pastor because the other guy was kicked out after he hit on me. He came in, and all he talked about was how many books he had, and he wanted to donate them to the Yale Divinity School. And what did I think about that? And I'm like, dude, my husband died like 4 hours ago, and you're talking to me about your library donation? Like, what?
Why would he even ask you something like that?
Because he was uncomfortable with death, obviously, and didn't have the right words to even.
And he was a hospice chaplain?
No. He was my local interim pastor.
Okay, that explains it. Right. Church. So that's an important piece of it too. So a regular minister or pastor in a church, we do not assume they know how to be present with death and grief. Because, and this is a pet peeve of mine too, is there are so many people out there right now claiming to be grief counselors or grief guides or grief supporters. And, I just finished 10 years of school training as a pastoral counselor. I have read all the research on grief and studied all the leading, teachers, and have trained in rooms with clinical supervision. And, I have been educated about how to work with grief. And if a counselor or a pastor has not had that kind of education, they are lacking really important information. I mean, they're still back in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages, which we rejected years ago.
Thank you. People still say that to me all the time. And I'm like, that is just I'm just so not there.
Well, nobody's there. It was never meant to apply to grief. It was her study was done on people who are facing their own death. Her study has been kind of debunked because her research methods weren't very good. And nobody goes through those stages. I mean, those are just feelings that you could have at any given time. And so, someday you might be in denial, another day you might be in anger, then the next day you'll go back to denial, and the next day you'll go to acceptance, and then, and you bounce all over the place. And so the new theory that we use now is something called the dual process model, which means that you spend some of your time focusing on your loss and how sad and hurt and suffering you are. And then other times you focus on restoration. And what am I going to do to feel better? And you can move between those things. And I have a video about that if you want me to send it to you about loss.
Oh, that is fantastic. I would love that. If I'll put the link in the below.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be a good link to have. So email me and I'll send it to you.
Okay.
So loss and restoration looks like, you go to bed at night and you're just crying and crying because your husband's not there and you can't sleep. And you get up in the morning and you're so miserable. But then your friend comes over and says, let's go for a hike. And you go for a hike, and for a little minute, you feel better. And now you're focused on restoration. Then you go home, and the house is empty, and you're focused on loss. But then for some reason, you decide to start going through the closet and starting to get rid of his clothes. And that's restoration. And so you do this 100 times a day. That's what has replaced the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages. But if you haven't studied this academically, you would have no way of knowing this.
That is amazing. This is the first time I've heard that. And I am literally, my whole body is just vibrating with joy because I feel like it's almost like, not that I've been fighting against it, but it is so entrenched in our society, that whole 5 blah, blah, blah. And I feel like guilty when I say, well, that's just it doesn't seem right to me. So I love that you've got the academic credentials to be able to say, yeah, it's not the way. And
there's,
what you just talked about feels so right. And that's exactly how I went through it. The loss, the restoration, the loss, restoration, and it ebbed and flowed,
And it will always do that. You'll do that
right.
forever.
I still do it. Right.
Yeah.
I still have days where I'll just out of nowhere, just have a huge grief wave. And then it's like, oh, okay.
And then, and then spiritually speaking, we want to teach ourselves to love that grief wave, not to hate it.
Yeah.
And to go, oh, there it is. Oh, there's that pain. I haven't felt that for years. It's been a while. This happened to me, not that long ago with my son when I was moving, and I was moving to a smaller place and I had to sell a bunch of furniture, including his bed that he died in.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to sell my son's bed. I wrote a chapter in one of my books about it. And I just, the guy who was going to buy it was on his way over, and I went and took off the sheets and got the bed ready. And I fell to pieces, just fell on the bed crying and screaming. And then after like 10 minutes of that, I got up and I went, wow, that was great. I loved that. I got to feel my pain again. It had been a few years since he died.
Right.
So, one thing we want to teach people is how to go into the pain and be with it rather than to just say, oh no, it's terrible, I don't want it. That helps a lot too.
Oh my gosh. Wow. I feel like I could talk to you all day. You've just got such great information. So thank you. And how can people get a hold of you if they're interested in either booking you as a speaker or wanting to do some of your programs?
Well, the Afterlife Conference is the best way. So afterlifeconference.com. There's an email link there, and of course, a subscribe link. I also have another website called spiritualityandgrief.com. And so that's my grief workshops. And I do them online now. And I also travel around the country and do them. So there's, the Afterlife Conference, which covers everything about death, and the spirituality and grief page, which is just for like grief work. And we do very intense grief work. Sometimes the workshops are a whole weekend, sometimes they're just half a day, but we do ceremony and deep meditation and art therapy and movement therapy. And it's all about unlocking the grief that's just stuck in this contracted place and opening up. And so the energy can flow out of you and not be stuck, because that's what happens with grief.
That is for sure. Absolutely. Well, I love it. You are doing such great work, Terri. And thank you so much for spending time with me today and sharing all of your, just a sliver of your amazing information that I know you're just filled with even more. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Exploring Death podcast. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Before you make any financial or legal decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Exploring Death. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.